Meredith Calloway, 38, stood frozen in the opulent lobby of the Grand Sapphire Resort, staring at her own brother and sister-in-law as they pretended not to recognize her. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked," James lied, avoiding her eyes. Little did they know, the inheritance they'd schemed to steal from her had been just a fraction of her wealth. The papers transferring ownership of their precious hotel chain were already in her briefcase. Tonight, 15 years of calculated patience would finally pay off. Before I continue with Meredith's story of family betrayal and sweet justice, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and if you enjoy true family drama with satisfying endings, hit that like button and subscribe to join our story community. Now let's dive deeper into how Meredith's perfect revenge unfolded. Meredith hadn't always been the powerhouse businesswoman now standing in the lobby of the Grand Sapphire Resort. 15 years ago, she had been a bright-eyed 2-3-year-old, fresh out of college with a business degree and dreams of joining her father's modest but successful hotel business. Calloway Hotels had been a family enterprise for 2 generations, with 3 mid-range hotels in Connecticut that her grandfather had built from nothing. Her father, Richard Calloway, had maintained the business with steady hands, never expanding but ensuring quality service that kept loyal customers returning year after year. "Dad, I've been thinking about my presentation next week," Meredith had told her father over Sunday dinner at the family home. "I really believe my expansion plan could take Calloway Hotels to the next level." Richard had nodded thoughtfully, his eyes crinkling with pride. "I've always known you had the business sense in the family, Mary. Your brother is good with people, but you've got vision." Her older brother James, sitting across the table with his wife Vanessa, had smiled tightly. At 30, James had already been working in the family business for 8 years, managing guest relations and front desk operations. He'd never shown interest in the financial side or growth strategies, but the comment had clearly stung. "We'll see what the board thinks," James had said dismissively, though the board was merely their father and the family attorney. What Meredith didn't know then was that James and Vanessa had already been meeting secretly with that same attorney. The dinner had been just 5 weeks before their father's unexpected heart attack. The day of the funeral remained seared in Meredith's memory. Rain had poured relentlessly as if the heavens themselves mourned Richard Calloway. She had stood between her brother and her mother, Catherine, all 3 draped in black beneath a canopy of umbrellas. Catherine, already frail from her battle with early-onset dementia, had clutched Meredith's hand with surprising strength. "He was so proud of you," Catherine had whispered. "So proud of what you would do with the business." James had overheard and shot Meredith a look that even in her grief had sent a chill through her. 3 days later, Meredith had sat in stunned silence in the attorney's wood-paneled office as Mr. Winters, their father's lawyer for 20 years, had read the will. "To my son, James Calloway, I leave full ownership and control of Calloway Hotels, with the stipulation that he provide for his mother's care and pay his sister Meredith a one-time settlement of $50,000. "That's impossible," Meredith had whispered, the blood draining from her face. "Dad always said I have the signed and notarized will right here, Miss Calloway." Mr. Winters had replied, not quite meeting her eyes as he slid the document across his mahogany desk. Meredith had scanned the paper, recognizing her father's signature, but nothing of his intentions. The will was dated just 2 weeks before his death, after their conversation about her expansion plans, after his expressed pride in her business acumen. "Something's wrong here," she had insisted, looking up to find James and Vanessa exchanging glances. "Dad told me just weeks ago that he wanted me to take over the financial direction of the company." James had placed a sympathetic hand on her shoulder. "Grief can confuse memories, Mary. Dad and I had several conversations about his wishes. He was concerned about your lack of practical experience." The condescension in his tone had been unmistakable. Vanessa had nodded solemnly beside him. Mr. Winters Meredith had turned to the attorney. "Was this will prepared by you?" The attorney had shifted uncomfortably. "It was prepared according to your father's instructions, yes." But that doesn't make sense. Dad and I had discussed Meredith had begun, but James had cut her off. Mary, please. This is hard enough without you making accusations. Dad made his choice. The $50,000 is generous. You can start your own business if you want. But Callaway Hotels stays with me as the firstborn. Something in his tone, a hint of smugness beneath the practiced sympathy, had ignited a suspicion in Meredith that would smolder for years to come. That evening, she had gone to visit her mother at the assisted living facility where she'd moved after the diagnosis. Catherine no longer had good days and bad days. There were only bad days and worse days. But sometimes, in brief moments of clarity, the mother Meredith had known would emerge. Mom, Meredith had said, gently taking her mother's papery hand, "Did Dad change his will recently? Did he tell you he was leaving the hotels to James instead of splitting them or letting me run them?" Catherine had frowned her eyes, momentarily focusing. "Your father wouldn't do that. He always said you were the one with the head for business, like him." Then her eyes had clouded again and she'd asked Meredith if she'd seen her husband today. The next morning, Meredith had called every bank in town until she found where her father had kept his safety deposit box, not at the bank Mr. Winters had mentioned, but at a smaller local institution. Using her status as next of kin and her father's death certificate, she had gained access. Inside, she'd found what she was looking for, a letter addressed to her in her father's handwriting, dated just 1 week before his death. "Dearest Meredith," it read, "I'm so proud of your business proposal. You're right that Callaway Hotels can be so much more, and I've decided to amend my will to reflect my confidence in your abilities. I'll be meeting with a new attorney next week. I've had some concerns about Winters lately. Until then, I wanted you to know my intentions. You will assume financial control of the company with your brother maintaining his role in operations. Together, I know you two will take what I've built and create something truly remarkable." The letter had been like a knife to her heart, confirmation of her suspicions, but no legal proof. She'd read it through tears, her grief compounded by the dawning realization of what must have happened. Over the following weeks, her attempts to challenge the will had been met with brick walls. Mr. Winters insisted everything was in order. The handwriting experts she'd hired had been inconclusive about whether her father's signature had been forged. Without concrete proof, and with limited funds for a legal battle against her now wealthy brother Meredith, had eventually been forced to accept the $50,000 settlement. The betrayal had cut deep, not just the loss of her inheritance, but the systematic way James and Vanessa had undermined her relationship with her father and stolen her future. As she'd watched them take control of Callaway Hotels, she'd made a silent promise to herself and to her father's memory: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The $50,000 settlement check had sat on Meredith's kitchen table for 3 days before she'd made her decision. She'd stared at it during her morning coffee, during hastily eaten TV dinners, and late into the night as she'd calculated and planned. It wasn't enough to fight James legally, but it was enough to start something new, something that would eventually lead to justice. "I'm moving to Chicago," she'd announced to her only real friend Elena over lunch. Elena had nearly choked on her sandwich. "Chicago, but your whole life is here in Connecticut." "Not anymore," Meredith had replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "There's nothing for me here except painful memories and a brother who's content to watch me struggle." Elena had reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "What will you do there?" "I'm going to start at the bottom of the hotel industry and work my way up, not as a Callaway, but as a nobody. I'll learn every aspect of the business from the ground up, build connections, and one day..." She hadn't finished the sentence, but her eyes had gleamed with determination. Arriving in Chicago with 2 suitcases and her settlement check, Meredith had rented a tiny studio apartment in a part of town that made her lock her door twice at night. She'd changed her surname to her mother's maiden name, Camden, severing the last visible tie to the family that had betrayed her. Her first job had been as a night desk clerk at the Lakeshore Inn, a budget hotel with questionable cleanliness standards. The manager, a perpetually exhausted man named Doug, had hired her on the spot, desperate for someone reliable for the graveyard shift. Experience, he'd asked perfunctorily. None in hotels, Meredith had answered honestly. She'd decided her new life would be built on truth, even if her ultimate goal required some strategic omissions. Doesn't matter. Can you use a computer and not steal from the register? When she'd nodded, he'd continued, You're hired. 11 to 7, 5 nights a week, minimum wage plus $1, trainings tonight. Those first months had been grueling. The night shift had wreaked havoc on her sleep cycle. The clientele had ranged from traveling salespeople on tight budgets to couples renting rooms by the hour. She'd dealt with drunk guests, bug complaints, and more than one attempt to negotiate rates with substances instead of cash. But Meredith had absorbed everything like a sponge. She'd learned the property management software inside out, volunteered for extra shifts to understand the daytime operations, and spent her free hours studying the hotel's financial statements that Doug had carelessly left accessible on the shared computer. 6 months in, she'd spotted a pattern in the books. Doug, she'd approached her manager cautiously. I noticed something in the quarterly reports. We're losing about $3,000 a month on laundry services. Doug had looked up from his phone, surprised. You're reading the quarterlies. I hope that's okay. I'm interested in the business side. But look, she'd shown him her analysis. If we switched to this local service instead of the chain we're using, we'd save almost 40% with the same quality. Doug had studied her notes, his eyebrows rising. You're right. He'd given her a speculative look. You know the assistant manager position is opening next month. Interested. Within a year, Meredith had become the assistant manager. By 18 months, when Doug had left for a better opportunity, she'd stepped into the manager role. Her salary had nearly tripled, and more importantly, she'd gained the attention of the regional director of the hotel group. Martin Greaves had been an industry veteran with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense approach. During his quarterly inspection, he'd been visibly impressed by the Lakeshore Inn's improvements under Meredith's management. Occupancy up 18%, costs down 15%, and guest satisfaction scores the highest in the region, he'd noted reviewing her reports. What's your secret, Miss Camden? No secret, she'd replied. Just attention to detail and respect for both the business and the guests. Martin had nodded thoughtfully. We're launching a new property downtown, more upscale than this place. I need someone who understands both the numbers and the people. Interested, the new position had come with another substantial pay raise and, more importantly, equity options in the new property. Meredith had thrown herself into the launch, working 16-hour days to ensure every detail was perfect. The Archer Hotel had opened to rave reviews and immediately begun turning a profit, almost unheard of in the industry where new properties typically took months to find their footing. By her 3rd year in Chicago, Meredith had begun investing her savings strategically. She'd lived well below her means, squirreling away every extra dollar. When a struggling boutique hotel had come on the market at a bargain price due to mismanagement, she'd secured a loan using her equity in the Archer as collateral and made her first independent purchase. The Hawthorne House had been a gem hiding beneath years of neglect. Meredith had renovated strategically, emphasizing the historic character while modernizing the essentials. Within a year, it had become one of the most sought-after boutique experiences in the city, featured in travel magazines and booked solid months in advance. Martin had watched her success with increasing interest. You know, he'd told her over dinner one evening, I've been in this business 30 years and I've never seen someone with your instincts. You should think bigger. I am Meredith, had replied with a small smile. I've been looking into a property in Detroit. Similar situation to the Hawthorne, good bones, bad management. I wasn't thinking Detroit, Martin had said, sliding a folder across the table. I'm retiring next year. The ownership group is looking for someone to take over as CEO of the regional division. 12 properties across the Midwest. Your name is at the top of their list. Meredith had opened the folder, her heart racing as she'd scanned the details. The position would put her in control of a significant hotel group with the resources and authority to expand aggressively. There's just one thing, Martin had added, watching her reaction carefully. They've been approached about a potential buyout by an East Coast group. Callaway Hotels, I believe. Small chain, but looking to expand. As CEO, handling that negotiation would be your first major task. Meredith had nearly dropped her wine glass. After 7 years, her path and James's were about to converge again, and this time she'd be negotiating from a position of power he couldn't imagine. The universe, it seemed, had a poetic sense of justice. I'd be very interested, she'd said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Very interested indeed. The corner office of Lake City Hotel Group's Chicago headquarters offered a panoramic view of the city Meredith had come to call home. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan to the east and the urban landscape to the west. But on this particular morning, Meredith wasn't admiring the view. Her attention was fixed on the dossier, open on her glass desk, a comprehensive analysis of Callaway Hotel's financial standing. They're overextended, she explained to Sophia Jung, her sharp-eyed CFO. James expanded too quickly after acquiring those properties in Rhode Island. Their debt-to-asset ratio is concerning, and their cash reserves wouldn't cover operations for more than 60 days if occupancy dropped even 10%. Sophia nodded, her expression thoughtful. So their interest in acquiring Lake City is less about strategic expansion and more about accessing our liquidity to shore up their position. Exactly. Meredith leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a small smile. My brother always did prefer shortcuts to sustainable growth. Over the past 3 years, as CEO of Lake City Hotel Group, Meredith had transformed the regional chain into a powerhouse. She'd refined their brand identity, focusing on creating unique experiences at each property while maintaining consistent quality standards. She'd invested in staff training and retention, resulting in service levels that garnered industry awards. Most importantly, she'd built a war chest, a substantial reserve of capital that allowed for strategic acquisitions without over-leveraging. The phone on her desk buzzed, and her assistant's voice came through the speaker. Miss Camden, Mr. Edwards is here for your 10 o'clock. Send him in, please, Meredith replied, exchanging a knowing glance with Sophia. Devin Edwards, Lake City's head of acquisitions and development, entered carrying his own stack of files. At 45, Devin had spent his entire career in the hotel industry and had an uncanny ability to identify undervalued properties with potential. Morning, ladies, he greeted them, setting his materials on the conference table near the window. I've finalized the valuation models for the Callaway properties. And Meredith prompted joining him at the table. And you were right, Devin said, spreading out several charts. On paper, they're asking for 30% more than their true value based on current market comps. But if we look at potential value with proper management, he pointed to another set of projections. There's significant upside, particularly with their flagship properties in Connecticut and their newer acquisitions in coastal Massachusetts. Meredith studied the numbers, thinking of the 3 original Callaway hotels her grandfather had built, properties now buried in her brother's expanded portfolio of 15 hotels. Those original 3 still outperformed most of James's acquisitions, riding on decades of goodwill and reputation that predated his mismanagement. What about their newest project, she asked. The Grand Sapphire Resort, Devin grimaced slightly. That's their biggest liability. Over budget by almost 40%, construction delays pushing back the opening and pre-bookings below projections. If we acquire them, I'd recommend a complete repositioning of that property. I have something different in mind, Meredith said, her tone measured. The meeting continued for another hour as they dissected every aspect of the potential acquisition, not just financials, but brand alignment, geographical strategy, and personnel considerations. By the end, they had developed a multi-phase plan that made Meredith's heart race with anticipation. So we're agreed, she concluded, looking between Sophia and Devon. When James and his team arrive tomorrow, we'll listen to their acquisition proposal. We'll express interest but concerns about valuation. We'll suggest they need to reduce their asking price by at least 25% for further discussion. They won't accept that, Sophia noted. No, they won't, Meredith agreed. They'll leave disappointed, but will likely come back within a month with a more reasonable offer given their cash position. And then Devon asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. And then we'll reveal our counter-proposal. We don't want to acquire them. We want them to consider being acquired by us. Meredith's eyes gleamed with the strategy she'd been crafting for years. We'll offer a premium for the original 3 Callaway properties and fair market value for the rest. James gets to save face with a good sale price, and I. She paused, allowing herself to imagine the moment. I get back what should have been mine all along. There's still one wild card, Sophia reminded her. The Grand Sapphire. Construction is nearly complete, but without proper capitalization for the launch and initial operations, it could fail spectacularly. That would impact Callaway's overall valuation before we can complete any deal. I've thought of that, Meredith said. I'm going to visit the property incognito next week. I need to assess it personally, see exactly what James has built and whether it can be salvaged. Later that evening, alone in her penthouse apartment, Meredith stood on her balcony with a glass of wine watching the play of lights across the lake. 15 years had passed since she'd left Connecticut with nothing but $50,000 and a burning sense of injustice. In that time, she'd rebuilt herself, completely new name, new city, new career trajectory. She'd worked harder than she'd ever imagined possible, sacrificing personal relationships and any semblance of work-life balance in pursuit of her goal. And now she was on the precipice of achieving it. Her phone chimed with a message from her assistant confirming her flight to Connecticut in 3 days. She would check into a hotel near the Grand Sapphire, not as Meredith Camden, CEO of Lake City Hotel Group, but as just another potential guest there to observe and evaluate. A pang of something not quite regret but perhaps melancholy washed over her as she thought of her mother. Catherine had passed away 5 years earlier, never having regained enough lucidity to understand what had happened with the family business. James had arranged an elaborate funeral playing the role of the devoted son to perfection. Meredith had attended but stayed at the periphery, unrecognized by most of her family's old acquaintances after so many years away, and with her changed appearance and name. She'd visited her mother's grave alone the next day, placing a single white rose on the headstone. I'm keeping my promise, Mom, she'd whispered. Dad's legacy won't end with James's mismanagement. I'll restore what was built, and I'll make it greater than anyone imagined. Now, as the day of reckoning approached, Meredith found herself thinking not just of victory, but of what would come after. For 15 years, every decision she'd made had been in service to this goal. Every relationship had been secondary to her mission. Every moment of joy had been tempered by the knowledge that her work was incomplete. What would fill that space once justice was served, she didn't know yet. But as she finished her wine and turned back toward the warmth of her apartment, she felt a flutter of something new. Anticipation not just for the culmination of her revenge, but for the freedom that might come after. But first, she had a hotel to visit and a brother to confront. I'm about halfway through our story now, and things are really heating up as Meredith prepares to confront her brother James after 15 years of careful planning. What do you think will happen when they finally meet face to face? Will James recognize her? I'd love to know your predictions. Hit that like button if you're enjoying Meredith's journey toward justice, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how this family drama unfolds. Now let's continue with what happens when Meredith arrives at the Grand Sapphire Resort. The Grand Sapphire Resort rose like a gleaming monolith against the Connecticut coastline, its glass facade reflecting the late afternoon sun in shades of gold and amber. Meredith observed it from her rental car parked in a public lot a quarter mile down the shore. She had to admit, albeit reluctantly, that the building itself was impressive, sleek, modern architecture, with just enough classical elements to give it timeless appeal. Appearance over substance, she murmured to herself, thinking of her brother's management style. Let's see if the inside matches the wrapper. She'd arrived in Connecticut 3 days ago, staying at a modest hotel in the neighboring town while conducting her reconnaissance. She'd driven past the original Callaway hotels, the Harborview, the Pinneridge, and the Wellington properties that should have been partly hers. Each visit had strengthened her resolve. Today, she'd changed into an understated but expensive pantsuit, styled her hair differently than her usual CEO appearance, and applied makeup that subtly altered the contours of her face. Not enough to be a disguise, but enough that a brother who hadn't seen her in 15 years and who wasn't expecting to see her might not immediately recognize her. The Grand Sapphire was in its soft opening phase, accepting limited reservations while staff training continued and final details were perfected. Meredith had booked a standard room for 2 nights under her Camden identity, using her personal credit card rather than any company accounts that might trigger recognition. Checking her appearance one last time in the rearview mirror, she steeled herself for what was to come. This visit wasn't just about evaluating the property. It was about witnessing firsthand what her brother had built with the resources he'd stolen from her. It was about looking into his eyes when he failed to recognize his own sister and deciding exactly how her revenge would play out. The hotel lobby was a soaring space with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and a massive sapphire blue glass sculpture as its centerpiece. Staff in crisp uniforms moved efficiently, though. Meredith's trained eye caught small signs of the operation's newness: a concierge slightly too eager bell, staff momentarily confused about procedures, a manager hovering anxiously near the front desk. Meredith approached reception, where a young woman with a practiced smile greeted her. "Welcome to the Grand Sapphire Resort." Checking in, "Yes, Meredith Camden. I have a reservation for 2 nights. As the receptionist typed on her computer, Meredith casually asked, "I've heard such wonderful things about this property. It's part of the Callaway Group, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am. This is the newest jewel in the Callaway portfolio and their most luxurious offering to date." The pride in the young woman's voice suggested good training in brand messaging. "Mr. Callaway himself has overseen every detail of the development." "How impressive," Meredith remarked, her tone neutral despite the surge of emotions the name evoked. "Is he often on property?" "Oh yes, during this opening phase, he's here daily." In fact, the receptionist glanced over Meredith's shoulder and straightened slightly, her professional smile widening. "That's him now." Meredith felt a jolt of adrenaline but kept her expression pleasant as she turned, room keycard in hand, to see her brother entering the lobby from a side hallway marked Administration. James Callaway at 45 looked every inch the successful hotel magnate in his tailored suit, silver threading through his dark hair at the temples in a way that added gravitas rather than age. Beside him walked a woman Meredith recognized as Vanessa, though the years had changed her too, still elegant but with a hardness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. They were deep in conversation with a man Meredith didn't recognize, presumably a hotel executive, and hadn't noticed her. She took the moment to observe them, noting James's expansive gestures, always the showman, and Vanessa's more contained energy as she periodically checked her phone. Meredith had planned to settle into her room before engineering an accidental meeting with James, but fate seemed to have other plans. As the trio approached the reception area, James looked up and his eyes passed over Meredith with the polite disinterest one shows a stranger. No recognition, not even a flicker. Something cold settled in Meredith's chest. 15 years was a long time, yes, and she had changed her formerly light brown hair, now darker and sleeker, her college girl softness replaced by the toned physique of a woman who used the gym to battle stress, her fashion sense elevated from department store to designer, but to not even see a shadow of familiarity in his own sister's face. It confirmed what she'd always suspected: James had never really seen her, not even when they were family. Making a split-second decision, Meredith turned as if to head toward the elevators but deliberately stepped into James's path, causing a minor collision. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, allowing her keycard and handbag to fall to the marble floor. "No harm done," James replied, automatically bending to retrieve her items at the same moment she did, resulting in another awkward bump. "Please allow me," he said, his customer service smile firmly in place as he handed her the keycard and bag. Up close, Meredith could smell his cologne, different from what he'd worn years ago, more expensive now, and see the faint lines around his eyes that hadn't been visible from a distance. "Thank you." "Clumsy of me," Meredith said, making deliberate eye contact. "I'm Meredith Camden, checking in for a couple of nights." Something flickered across James's face, not recognition but perhaps the unconscious awareness that sometimes registers when meeting someone who shares DNA. But it passed, quickly replaced by the practiced charm of a hotelier greeting a valued guest. "James Calloway, owner of this establishment. Welcome to the Grand Sapphire, Miss Camden. I hope you'll enjoy your stay with us." Vanessa had joined them, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as she assessed Meredith with the swift calculation of a woman accustomed to evaluating other women as potential threats or assets. "Miss Camden is staying with us for 2 nights, dear," James informed his wife. "Miss Camden, my wife Vanessa, who serves as our Director of Guest Experiences." "Lovely to meet you," Meredith said, shaking Vanessa's manicured hand and noting the massive diamond ring that had replaced the more modest one from 15 years ago. "This is my first time at a Calloway property." "The building is stunning. We're very proud of it," Vanessa replied. "If there's anything you need during your stay, please don't hesitate to ask for me personally." Meredith smiled, knowing she would do exactly that, but not for the reasons Vanessa imagined. "Actually," Meredith set a plan forming instantly, "I'd love to learn more about the property. I'm in the hospitality industry myself, small boutique hotels in the Midwest, and I'm always looking for inspiration." "Perhaps you offer tours for industry professionals." James's interest visibly heightened at the mention of her profession. Networking was the lifeblood of the hotel business, and he clearly hadn't lost his instinct for it. "We don't typically offer formal tours during this soft opening phase, but I'd be happy to make an exception for a fellow hotelier," he said. "Perhaps tomorrow morning, say 10 o'clock in the lobby. That would be perfect, thank you," Meredith replied, already anticipating the opportunity to probe for weaknesses in his operation and perhaps drop a few carefully chosen comments to unsettle him. As they parted ways, Meredith heading to the elevators and James continuing toward reception with his entourage, she felt the first real surge of satisfaction since arriving in Connecticut. She hadn't planned on revealing herself to James just yet, but this gradual approach might yield even more satisfying results, allowing her to observe him in his element, gather intelligence directly, and ultimately make her big revelation all the more dramatic. In her luxuriously appointed room on the 12th floor, Meredith stood at the window overlooking the Atlantic, the sun now setting and casting long shadows across the water. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophia back in Chicago. "Board approved our offer strategy. Legal finalizing paperwork. How's the reconnaissance going?" Meredith typed her reply. "Better than expected. Meeting with Jay tomorrow for personal tour. Property impressive, but noticing staffing inefficiencies and signs of cash flow constraints. Will update after tour." She set her phone down and unpacked, methodically hanging her clothes in the closet and arranging her toiletries in the marble bathroom. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, just like the strategy she'd been crafting for 15 years. Tomorrow, she would begin the endgame, and James wouldn't see it coming until it was far too late. At precisely 9:55 the next morning, Meredith stepped out of the elevator into the Grand Sapphire's lobby. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a cobalt blue suit that was both professional and striking, with subtle gold accessories that complemented the hotel's color scheme. The message was subliminal but clear: she belonged in this environment. James was already waiting, engaged in conversation with a staff member but glancing periodically toward the elevators. When he spotted her, he excused himself and approached with the confident stride of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Miss Camden, good morning," he greeted her, extending his hand. "I hope you found your room satisfactory." "More than satisfactory," Meredith replied, shaking his hand firmly. "The view is spectacular, and the bed might be the most comfortable I've experienced in a hotel." James beamed with obvious pride. "We imported those mattresses from Sweden, a custom design exclusive to Callaway Properties. But you haven't experienced the full Grand Sapphire until you've seen our amenities. Shall we begin the tour?" For the next hour, Meredith followed James through the property, maintaining her cover as an impressed industry colleague, while mentally cataloging every detail. The Grand Sapphire was undeniably luxurious: a rooftop infinity pool overlooking the Atlantic, a spa featuring treatments with actual crushed sapphire in the exfoliants, 5 restaurants ranging from casual beachside dining to a formal establishment with a Michelin-starred chef. Yet her experienced eye caught what others might miss: the slightly undermanned front desk during a checkout rush, the housekeeping carts that lacked standardized organization, the restaurant host who had to check 3 different systems before locating a reservation. Small inefficiencies that multiplied across operations would significantly impact the bottom line. "Your concept is fascinating," Meredith commented as they rode the elevator to the penthouse level, integrating local maritime history with modern luxury. "Did you develop this branding strategy in-house or work with a consultant?" "Entirely in-house," James replied, the pride evident in his voice. "My wife and I personally oversaw every aspect of the design and positioning." "Impressive." At Lake City, we've found that partnering with specialized firms can sometimes bring fresh perspectives, especially for flagship properties. But there's certainly value in maintaining a cohesive vision. James's expression flickered briefly at the mention of her company. "Lake City? I don't believe I'm familiar with that group." "We're primarily Midwest-based at present," Meredith explained, watching him carefully. 12 properties across 5 states with expansion plans in development. "Ah, regional players. Challenging market segment." His condescension was subtle but unmistakable. "We started small too, of course, though we've accelerated our growth considerably in recent years." "Yes, I've noted your expansion. Quite ambitious." Meredith kept her tone neutral, though internally she was cataloging his dismissiveness as another debt to be repaid. "I understand you've acquired nearly a dozen properties in the past decade." 15, actually, James corrected her, leading her onto the penthouse floor. "The Callaway portfolio now includes 18 properties with the Grand Sapphire as our crown jewel." They entered the presidential suite, a sprawling 3,000 square foot space with panoramic ocean views, marble, everything, and furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. James gestured expansively as he highlighted various features clearly in his element as the magnanimous host. "This is where we'll accommodate celebrities, CEOs, and the occasional foreign dignitary," he explained. "We've already booked it for the summer season. A film director, 2 tech entrepreneurs, and a European noble I'm not at liberty to name." "The space is certainly impressive," Meredith acknowledged. "Though I'm curious about your occupancy projections for the regular suites and standard rooms." "In our experience, the ultra-luxury market can be volatile, especially for new properties without established reputations." A flash of something, annoyance perhaps, or concern crossed James's face before his professional mask returned. "Our projections are extremely positive. We've had strong pre-bookings and our marketing campaign is generating significant interest." "That's fortunate," Meredith replied. "Many properties in this segment struggle with cash flow during their first year. The capital requirements for maintaining this level of service can be substantial while building a client base." James's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "We're well capitalized and have extremely competent financial management." "Of course," Meredith said smoothly. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise. Financial stability is something I'm particularly attentive to given my background." "Oh, and what is your background, Miss Camden?" James asked, seemingly eager to shift the conversation away from his hotel's finances. I started at the very bottom night desk clerk at a budget property and worked my way up, Meredith said, watching his face closely. Unlike some in this industry, I didn't inherit my position or my properties. If James caught the barb, he didn't show it. Admirable. Though I find that family businesses bring unique advantages, shared values, long-term vision, trust. Trust, Meredith repeated, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. Yes, that would be invaluable. They had completed the circuit of the presidential suite and stood now in its entryway. Meredith checked her watch, a deliberate gesture to signal the tour's conclusion. Thank you for your time, Mr. Calloway. This has been most enlightening. James, please, he insisted, with practiced charm. Perhaps you'd join Vanessa and me for dinner this evening. We're hosting a small gathering of investors and industry colleagues in our private dining room. Someone with your experience might find the networking valuable. Meredith considered the invitation. She hadn't planned on revealing herself quite so soon, but the opportunity to observe James and Vanessa with their investors to potentially gather intelligence on their financial situation was too valuable to pass up. I'd be delighted, she replied. What time should I arrive? 7:30. Cocktails first, then dinner at 8. Business casual is fine. As they parted in the lobby, James to attend to hotel business and Meredith ostensibly to enjoy the spa, she felt a curious mix of emotions. There was the expected satisfaction of seeing her plan unfold, but also an unexpected hollowness. The brother who had betrayed her so thoroughly wasn't a cartoon villain, but a flawed, ordinary man with obvious insecurities beneath his polished exterior. It didn't change what he'd done, nor did it diminish her determination to reclaim what was rightfully hers. But it added a complexity to her feelings that she hadn't anticipated. In her room, Meredith made 2 important calls. First to Sophia in Chicago, updating her on the property's strengths and weaknesses and confirming that their acquisition strategy remained sound. Then to Devin, instructing him to accelerate the timeline on their counter-proposal. I want all the paperwork ready within 48 hours, she told him. After tonight, I may need to move quickly. The afternoon passed with Meredith alternating between work emails and careful preparation for the evening ahead. She selected a dress that struck the perfect balance between business and cocktail attire black, with subtle sapphire blue accents that would register subconsciously as belonging in this environment. As she applied her makeup, she studied her reflection, searching for traces of the young woman who had left Connecticut 15 years ago. That Meredith had been wounded, angry, determined, but uncertain. The woman who stared back at her now was something else entirely, polished, powerful, purposeful. Tonight she decided she would not yet reveal her true identity. She would observe, gather information, and continue to build her advantage. But soon, perhaps as early as tomorrow, she would drop the Camden mask and watch as recognition and realization dawned on her brother's face. The anticipation of that moment carried her through the final preparations and down to the hotel's exclusive restaurant where James's private dinner party awaited. The private dining room of Sapphire, the Grand Sapphire Resort's signature restaurant, exuded exclusivity. A long table of polished walnut dominated the space set for 12 with fine china crystal and arrangements of white orchids. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the moonlit Atlantic, while discreet lighting created an atmosphere of intimate luxury. Meredith arrived precisely at 7:30, handed her wrap to the attendant, and stepped into the adjoining lounge where cocktails were being served. James was holding court near the bar, Vanessa at his side in a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Around them clustered what Meredith assumed were the investors he'd mentioned, mostly older men with expensive watches and that particular stance of the wealthy and self-assured. "Ah, Miss Camden," James called, spotting her entrance. "Please join us." As Meredith approached, she noted how Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly in assessment, cataloging her dress, her jewelry, her posture with the swift calculation of a woman accustomed to ranking other women in terms of threat level. Apparently satisfied that Meredith posed no social competition, Vanessa offered a practiced smile. Welcome, she said, extending her hand. James mentioned you're in the hotel business as well. Midwest Properties, was it? That's right, Meredith confirmed, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server. Lake City Hotel Group. We're smaller than Callaway, but growing steadily. I don't believe I've heard of it, Vanessa remarked with the faintest hint of dismissal. You will, Meredith replied, simply, her smile pleasant, but her eyes holding Vanessa's for just a beat longer than was comfortable. James smoothly inserted himself into the conversation, introducing Meredith to the assembled guests, a real estate developer, two private equity managers, a retired banking executive, and his wife and the Callaway's attorney. Meredith registered that last presence with particular interest, wondering if it was the same Mr. Winters who had facilitated the theft of her inheritance. But no, this was a younger man introduced as Andrew Pelham of Bergman, Pelham and Walsh. And this, James concluded, gesturing to a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, is Martin Greaves, recently retired from the hotel industry and now one of our key advisors. Meredith nearly choked on her champagne. Martin, her former mentor, the man who had guided her rise at Lake City, standing here among James's inner circle. She hadn't expected this complication. Martin's eyes widened in obvious recognition, though. He recovered quickly. Miss Camden, he said, shaking her hand firmly. A pleasure. Mr. Greaves, she replied, maintaining her composure. I believe your reputation precedes you. Your work with the Archer Hotel in Chicago was quite remarkable. Martin's eyes communicated a silent question, which Meredith answered with the slightest shake of her head. He understood immediately and played along. You're familiar with Chicago's hotel landscape, he asked conversationally. Intimately, Meredith replied. It's been my home for the past 15 years. The cocktail hour continued with light conversation, Meredith carefully building her cover story while extracting valuable information about the Grand Sapphire's financing and future plans. James, she noted, became increasingly animated as the champagne flowed, his natural tendency toward self-aggrandizement amplified by alcohol and an appreciative audience. The Grand Sapphire is just the beginning, he announced as they moved toward the dining table. We've identified 3 more potential locations for similar luxury properties: Hamptons, Palm Beach, Napa Valley. The Callaway Luxury Division will redefine American hospitality. As they took their seats for dinner, Meredith strategically placed between Martin and one of the equity managers. She observed the reactions to James's proclamation. The investors exchanged glances that contained more skepticism than enthusiasm. Vanessa looked momentarily alarmed before composing her features. The attorney studied his menu with sudden intensity. Interesting, Meredith thought. The ambitious expansion plans weren't receiving the unqualified support James clearly expected. Throughout the exquisite 5-course dinner, Meredith maintained her role as the interested industry colleague, asking insightful questions and sharing carefully edited stories from her own career. But beneath the pleasant conversation, she was conducting reconnaissance, noting which investors seemed most concerned about financials, observing the dynamic between James and Vanessa, watching for signs of the cracks she was certain existed in the Callaway empire. During the dessert course, Martin leaned closer to speak privately. I had no idea you'd be here, he murmured. I'm consulting on their staff training program, a short-term contract. If I'd known, it's fine, Meredith assured him quietly. In fact, it's perfect. I assume you haven't mentioned your previous connection to Lake City. No, they approached me through a mutual contact. I didn't realize the Callaways were related to. They don't know either, Meredith cut in softly. At least not yet. Understanding dawned in Martin's eyes. The acquisition talks, he whispered. Lake City isn't just another bidder, is it? This is personal. Meredith merely smiled and turned to respond to a question from across the table. As coffee and digestives were served, the conversation shifted more explicitly to business. One of the equity managers, a sharp-eyed woman named Eleanor, directed a pointed question at James. The construction overruns on this property have been substantial, she noted. What assurances can you provide that the next 3 projects will stay within budget. James's smile tightened slightly. The circumstances here were unique. Unexpected environmental remediation supply chain issues during the pandemic's aftermath. We've implemented new controls for future projects, and the current cash position Eleanor pressed. The debt service on this property alone must be substantial. We're comfortable with our financials, James replied, an edge entering his voice. The pre-opening phase is always capital-intensive, but bookings are strong for the summer season. Eleanor seemed unconvinced, but nodded politely. The banking executive, however, continued the line of questioning. I understand you've been approached by another hotel group regarding a potential acquisition, he said. Care to comment on that? James shot a surprised look at his attorney before composing his features. We've had preliminary discussions with several interested parties. As a privately held company, we're always evaluating strategic opportunities, but we have no immediate plans to sell. Meredith took a deliberate sip of her port, using the glass to hide her smile. So James hadn't shared the Lake City offer with his investors. Interesting. Actually, she said, setting down her glass, I believe I might be familiar with one of those interested parties. All eyes turned to her. Oh, James asked, his tone careful. Which one? Lake City Hotel Group? Meredith replied calmly. My company. A moment of stunned silence followed her revelation. Your.com. Panny. James repeated his expression, shifting from confusion to shock. You're not just an employee. No, Mr. Calloway, Meredith said, using his surname deliberately. I'm the CEO and primary shareholder of Lake City Hotel Group. We control 12 properties across the Midwest with a market valuation approximately 30% higher than Calloway Hotels. She paused, enjoying the moment. And we're very interested in your portfolio, particularly your original Connecticut properties. The atmosphere in the room transformed instantly. The investors leaned forward with newfound interest. Vanessa's face paled visibly. The attorney began frantically taking notes. This is highly irregular, James sputtered, his composure cracking. To misrepresent yourself this way, did I misrepresent myself? Meredith asked innocently. I stated I was in the hospitality industry with boutique hotels in the Midwest. That's entirely accurate. She turned to address the table at large. What I haven't mentioned until now is that I have a particular interest in the Calloway portfolio because of its history. She locked eyes with James, whose confusion was rapidly giving way to suspicion. A history I'm intimately familiar with, she continued, given that my father founded the original company. The banker frowned. I thought you said your name was Camden. It is now, Meredith replied. But I was born Meredith Calloway. James is my brother. The revelation landed like a thunderbolt. Gasps and murmurs erupted around the table. Vanessa knocked over her water glass. James sat frozen, his face, a mask of shock as 15 years of carefully maintained separation collapsed in an instant. Meredith, he finally managed, his voice barely audible. But you disappeared. You took the settlement and left. We thought you were in Europe somewhere. I took what little you left me, Meredith corrected him, her voice level despite the emotions surging through her, and I built something far greater than what you stole. And now I've come to reclaim what should have been mine all along. The Grand Sapphire's lobby fell silent as Meredith stepped through the revolving doors the next morning, James and Vanessa trailing behind her like chastened children. The prior evening's revelation had led to a private meeting in James's office, one where Meredith had presented irrefutable evidence of their past betrayal alongside Lake City's acquisition terms. Now employees watched in confusion as their boss solemnly introduced his long-lost sister as the property's new owner. Poetic justice, Meredith thought, remembering that first night when they'd pretended not to recognize her. Today marked not an ending but a beginning, the restoration of her father's legacy under her rightful leadership. What a journey it's been sharing my family's story with you all. It's taken 15 years, but finally seeing the look on my brother's face when justice was served made it all worthwhile. I've learned that patience and persistence can overcome even the deepest betrayals, and that success truly is the best revenge. Has anyone else experienced family karma coming full circle in their life? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this tale of long-awaited justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to my NTOCR/my/ channel for more real-life dramas with satisfying endings. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, does eventually arrive. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, sometimes the family you build is more loyal than the family you're born into.